Hello everyone and welcome to January the 3rd. It'll go out January the 4th, I guess. If I'm sneezing and coughing, it's not because I've got cold, it's because I've been moving books around. I've been putting away last year's books on any shelf space I can find. I made my list of favourites, I took photos of my favourites. They are in a kind of shelf of honour. The rest have been salted away in various places. And the worst of last year, which numbers about 7 or 8, are piled away, ready to be donated with my next batch of charity shop books. It includes this pile of shame, the two Far Eastern, Japanese and Korean novels about bookshops that everybody was hyping last year that I decided was, both of them were absolutely awful. Everybody else loved them. I thought they were dreadful. Soppy is what I thought. Undercharacterized, underbaked, fairly plotless, but with some kind of weird feeling of mindfulness and the idea that books and proximity to books in and of themselves is a good thing. No, you've got to put more effort in than that, I think. That's the thing with mindfulness. You do have to try as well. You've got to remember, with all that colouring in, for example, that they do in mindfulness things, I remember colouring in and getting all the colour all down your hand and down your arm, and your fingers would be cramped because you've been colouring in so madly. I think a good bit of effort doing these things. And the same goes for reading. Reading isn't a nice, relaxing hobby. Reading takes you everywhere and can upset you and can change your life. It's not a nice, relaxing, mindful hobby. Neither is writing, but that's a whole other story. Since New Year, I've read a whole bunch of things. This is my folio edition, my fancy frou-frou folderol edition from Folio, the Folio Society, which I have mixed feelings about. They're very nice books, of course, but you think a lot of them probably go unread and are just on people's shelves for show. Maybe that's cynical. This is a copy of Cautionary Tales and Other Verses by Hilaire Belloc, illustrated by Posey Simmons in 1997. It's a beautiful book, and it does make it incredibly readable to have it in a nice edition like this. This on eBay costs the same as any edition of Hilaire Belloc would. And I got this because we're doing it for book club next week. I read them on New Year's Eve. Most of them, the Cautionary Tales, the 2 volumes, and then the thing about animals. And they're okay. It's a bit like reading Edward Lear these days, where you kind of know the funny bits, so you've heard them, and they're less funny than you think they're going to be. It's interesting to look at, but not hysterical. What it reminded me of was Edward Gorey, and I dug this out just today, found it again, my copy of The Doubtful Guest. Now, Edward Gorey takes the same kind of stuff, the same feeling of Victoriana or Edwardiana, and conjures a similar world. This kind of Edgar Allan Poe, but macabre Edgar Allan Poe, and verses that are meant to admonish us or warn us, and a terrible black humour. And he mixed it all up into these wonderful picture books that he clearly laboured over. You can see that Tim Burton takes almost everything from Edward Gorey And Tim Burton himself, of course, did his book of nonsense verse, The Lonely Death of Oyster Boy in the 90s, a book that I treasure, and I know my sister does, and various other people really love. But really the roots are back in Gorey, and this is from, what year? 57. And this is the funniest. Alongside Mr. Earbrass writes a novel, which is very funny as well. When they answered the bell on that wild winter night, there was no one expected and no one in sight. Then they saw something standing on top of an urn, whose peculiar appearance gave them quite a turn. All at once it leapt down and ran into the hall, where it chose to remain with its nose to the wall. It was seemingly dead to whatever they said, so at last they stopped screaming and went off to bed. It joined them at breakfast and presently ate all the syrup and toast and part of a plate. It wrenched off the horn of the new gramophone and could not be persuaded to leave it alone. He's a kind of penguin in boots, but not a penguin. He's kind of hairy as well. It betrayed a great liking for peering up flues and for peeling the soles of its white canvas shoes. At times it would tear out whole chapters from books or put roomfuls of pictures askew on their hooks. Every Sunday it brooded and lay on the floor, inconveniently close to the drawing-room door. Now and then it would vanish for hours from the scene, but alas, be discovered inside a tureen. It was subject to fits of bewildering wrath, during which it would hide all the towels from the bath. That's where being northern ruins the rhyme. In the night through the house, it would aimlessly creep, in spite of the fact of its being asleep. It would carry off objects of which it grew fond and protect them by dropping them into the pond. It's my favourite bit. He drops his watch, his fob watch. All the men wear these fur coats, just like Edward Gorey himself used to. It came 17 years ago, and to this day, it has shown no intention of going away. I seem to have inadvertently read the book in its entirety, he inconveniently said. This is what I read on New Year's Day. My friend Katie gave me this. It's a Badger book. She gave me 2 of them. Turns out they're worth quite a lot. They're pulp novels of about 55,000 words that these authors would write in a weekend, apparently, or quite quickly. This one's Leo Brett, which is the pen name of somebody else who also wrote lots of these. They were based in London, and they were a part of a publisher called John Spencer. And looking at it, they seem to publish science fiction, westerns, war, weird fantasy, crime, hospital romance, and that seems to be it that's listed here. And a whole batch of them would come out each month. I long for that kind of world, where you have books unpretentiously coming out with these lurid, wonderful covers that cover every genre. I would read them all, I think. One of the things I loved about going to America, the first time I went, was going to Barnes & Noble and realising that mass market paperbacks were there in huge profusion by the tills, and they covered every single genre you could think of, all the splitting hairs genres in science fiction or horror or whatever. There are so many streams of stories and kinds of stories, and I wish we had it here. Anyway, this is one of the strangest books I've read. I read it in a day, and it seems to be entirely made up as the author's gone along. It's about an alchemist in the 18th century and his daughter, and they're brewing up a strange kind of potion, and they call up Morgan Le Fay from the Arthurian tales, and she tells of a system of magic in which hell and heaven are stepping stones, or there's lots of stepping stones to get to either, and they move around this kind of system of worlds. We also meet the boy who's infatuated with the girl, of course, and he's a locksmith's apprentice, and the locksmith gets involved as well, and the vicar who knows the locksmith, and they all end up chasing each other deeper and deeper into this fantasy world of monsters. There are strange creatures with detachable heads and kind of zombie creatures and cannibals involved. And it seems fairly arbitrary who we meet as we end up in the castle of Morgan Le Fay. And there's all this stuff about fighting the supreme evil one eventually. It's all finished off quite quickly, as if the author suddenly realised he was out of pages. He'd got his characters together, and the young female lead is about to be sacrificed, and it all finishes quite quickly. A bit like a modern science fiction shows, where there's lots and lots of build-up, and then suddenly it's like, oh, it's almost finished. There's a weird scene where the vicar meets a faun and goes for tea with him, so you think, oh, that's suddenly a bit of Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And Morgan Le Fay does have a touch of the White Queen about her. And then there's touches of H.P. Lovecraft. So it's the closest thing to the Lion, the Witch and H.P. Lovecraft I've read, which is quite nice. So it was well worth dipping into and maybe researching others in this line. We'll see. That's The Forbidden by Leo Brett. I did look up other books published under that list, and they were extraordinary. The covers are really lurid and really funny. And then I went to on New Year's Day, I went to my book bags, my tote bag book club that I've been talking about building up, and emptied the first bag. Each bag's got 6 books in. They're not random, they're from my to-be-read shelves. So they're all things I mean to read. I just happen to have bagged up about 16 of them. 16 bags worth, which is, more than 2 years anyway. We'll see if I stick to it. But I love the idea of, on the first of the month, picking out a bag and getting these 6 books that you've forgotten, you've put by. And the first one I've started to read, because I've got to try and stick to it, and not demur. Because if I pick this up, oh yes, that's something I want to read at some point, there's nothing initially that grabs me. And this was on my shelf for a while, and I'd pass it by. But when I artificially induce interest by saying, here's my book bag, I was straight into it, and I'm halfway through now, and I love it, and I wish I'd read it before when I bought it. So it just shows. This is set in Dublin and London and Paris, and it's a dual level, 2 times novel, in which we're in the 1920s, following this woman as she becomes a rare books expert and dealer, and we get cameos by Hemingway and James Joyce in Paris, and she goes on the hunt for a lost Bronte manuscript. In the present day, there's a story about a young woman, also a runaway from an abusive husband, and a bit of a murder mystery. There's a young academic that she's falling for, a crotchety old lady who owns the big house. Next door, there's a slightly spooky invisible bookshop that's there sometimes and not others. Halfway through, we don't know what this mystery is about, whether it's ghostly or what is it. I think it's obviously magical realist in essence. So something that looks from the packaging like some soppy, life-affirming book club type book about how lovely bookshops are. That's exactly what it looks like, and there's a glut of those in the world at the moment. It's become something much more subtle and game-playing and funny than that, I think. Not funny, witty. Um, because it is about bookish people and how they become ineluctably involved in slightly melodramatic, very literary adventures with accidental killings and the rest of it. And we care about them. There's some genuine, heartfelt emotion on the page, I think, when it comes to uh, foiled relationships and people not quite saying exactly what they mean and falling out of touch and running away. All that stuff is good, and people finding new places to feel safe and to follow their dreams. That's important stuff as well. So it's a very evocative, bookish novel with which to start the year. So I'll let you know how it finishes, and uh, I'll be back on here in a couple of days, and maybe by then I'll be on to my next book from my bookish tote bag book club thing. Today as well, I've begun writing again, which I'm happy about. I've written about 1,500 words, and that will do. Back on this particular spooky short story, which I began before Christmas, that's going along quite nicely and getting quite long. There's going to be a longer short story, which is good. Don't know how it's going to finish yet. It's got to balance and work out. So I'm still following it. That's what you do. That's you follow your nose through a story to see where it's going to lead you. And if you get to the right place, then you can kind of reframe it and make it look as if it was always going there. That's what you do. Okay. Socks, are you coming in? He's been shouting. Okay, it's getting later in the afternoon and I want some time to read. I will say goodbye and I'll see you again quite soon. Goodbye.